without turning around. Yeah. All right, that's great. Okay. So, welcome to the beer flavorings meeting. I do these things once in a while. I am not a hophead. I am an anti-hophead, and so I like to use spices and herbs and things in beer. You guys are only familiar with one flower, which is the hop. I am familiar with many flowers. So let's try and this thing's very sensitive. So let's think about fruit beer, or spice beer. What do we want out of it, right? And there's a lot of ways to approach it, but you sort of have to have a concept in mind when you begin brewing a beer, when you formulate a recipe, so you know what you're trying to do, right? And, maybe you're trying to like clone a Lindemann's Framboise or whatever, and that's fine. That's one objective. But really, whatever the stuff you're adding to the beer is going to perform a function. And what's that function? Well, let's think of it in terms of a culinary aspect. This is exactly the same sort of reasoning I use when I'm pairing beers with foods, is that I'm looking for the different types of interactions between the beer and the food, and you'll be looking for those with your additives with the beer itself. So do you want to complement the beer, right? Well, there's a lot of ways to complement things, and you're very familiar with complementation. You have lambics, which have fruit in it, right? So the sour and fruit, they're natural pairing, and a lot of them, they add sugar too, right? So the sugar is also part of that fruit thing, and we'll kind of cover sugar a little bit after we talk a little bit about fruit. And then, with the wheat beers too, there are usually funky yeasts that have unusual flavors, sometimes fruity flavors, and maybe there are other fruits that complement the fruits that the yeast are putting off, and you want to add those, right? So complementation is kind of an idea, right? You want to take things and put threads together and kind of connect things a little bit. You want contrast, perhaps, right? Contrast is a little more difficult to work with in beer because usually what you get from a contrast is a bad flavor. So you're not necessarily looking for contrast, but sometimes contrasts work, and goes is a perfect example, right? You have salty and sour. These are contrasting flavors. You wouldn't necessarily think they go together, but they work in the goes, right? Maybe there's fans of goes, maybe there aren't. But I'm a fan of goes, and I like that saltiness in the beer and the way it complements the other flavors. And then there are synergies, and these are things that you can't really explain in terms of complementation or contrast, but they're things that just work together, right? Chocolate and raisins work together, right? Chocolate and peanut butter works together. As a matter of fact, chocolate works with a lot of things, right? So with the stouts, there's the chocolate flavor of the malts, and so you can match that with cherries, or you could even put it in with the bourbon, right? One of the main reasons why the bourbon works with an imperial stout is you've got all of those dark fruit flavors and all of those chocolate flavors that are in there, right? And so those synergies kind of come together. But above all else, when you're thinking about your beer, you want the intensity of the flavors that you're matching to be the same, right? You have one flavor that's too intense, it's just going to dominate the whole thing and wash the other thing out. And this is where I think a little bit of experience comes in, right? You're going to do it once. It may not be the way you want it, and so you may have to do it again. And so you're going to have to think about it and do it a couple of times before you get it right. I think I'm on my fifth recipe of mugwort saison, right? And it's really moving target because every year I pick the mugwort in Ridley Creek Park, and it's going to be a little bit different every year because it's more sunny one year, more rainy another year. And so I'm like balancing that, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And it just always seems to evade me. So also what you want to think about is the best way to highlight your ingredient, right? And so with fruit beers, there are a couple of methods to do it. One of which is to just brew lighter kind of beers. Wheats and sours are useful because these are generally beers that don't have a lot of other flavors, and so you could let the fruits shine, or you can match the sour with the fruit. But these big beers are not without their utility when it comes to fruit beers, right? Because we've already gone over cherries with stout, raspberries too. So these are good things. Sweetness also works together with some of these big beers with the fruit flavors. Fruits like sweetness, right? As a matter of fact, it's like really one of the most common ways that people will like think a beer is sweet is if it's a very fruity beer. It could be dry as a bone, but if it's fruity, people will say, "Oh, I think it's sweet." Fruit and sweet are really two flavors that you always associate together. And so whenever you're eating fruit, you're getting sweet at the same time. And so your mind naturally tastes fruit and it thinks sweet. It's not always that way, but that's how you think. So you could put the sweetness in the beer and it'll work even if it's a lighter beer. Spiced beers are a little bit different, right? You're definitely not going to want a light beer with spices. Spices are very heavy-handed sorts of things, and they're going to give you big, bold flavors. What goes with spices? Caramel goes great with spices, right? So you can start thinking of using a lot of caramel malts, big like barley wines and things like that. You could throw spices in. You're all familiar with, Christmas spiced beers and pumpkin spiced beers, big beers, right? Got a lot of caramel malts in them, right? And that works very well with the spices. So these are the kinds of things that you're thinking about. And just to highlight that, when you get these big beers, spices which have big flavors, work with the intensity matching as well. And so that's kind of one of the things you want to be looking at. With herb beers, really herbs are often used for teas. So you don't necessarily want caramel in your tea or anything like that. So what you're looking for is kind of something that's got maybe a little bit of a biscuity thing, thinking tea and scones or something like that, right? So you're thinking in terms of the grist being maybe light, maybe amber, letting the herb shine, but also maybe adding a little bit of a twist to the herb. So think about it in those terms. One thing you have to always remember, though, is like all of the flavor ingredients, even fruit to some degree, add bitterness. So whatever you're brewing, you got to take the hop bitterness down a notch. Otherwise, you're going to get something that's too bitter. And if you're adding sugar to it, maybe you can kind of balance off and shave off a little bit of that, bitter perception in the final beer. But in general, what you want to think about is like, okay, if I'm adding cloves and cinnamon, I'm going to be extracting bitterness from these things. So I got to take it down a notch and make sure that I'm not making something that's going to be too bitter. I know you guys all love bitterness, but it's not the only flavor in beer. So we'll think about it that way. So there's a couple of slides in thinking about how much to add. Later on in the slideshow, I'm going to be making proposals about how much to add, but just let's think about how much we want to add, right? And there are different ways, and it depends to add stuff, and it depends really on what you want out of your beer. But if you're brewing for competitions, then usually they're going to ask you to specify a beer style that you're adding your flavor additive to. Once you've done that, that style has to show, right? It's not just the ingredient. The ingredient may complement the style, may add something to the style, but in general, you want, when you're coming to judges, you want that beer style to show. And like we had a little bit of an exchange about judging there on the Facebook site, but the judges actually have their guidelines. They're reading them while they work, and the one guideline of the herb spice beer is like, if it's a style, the style has to show. So you can't add so much that the style's not showing. So you want the balanced flavors where they complement one another, but the style and the flavor are all there in equal intensity, so you get both of them. If you add too much, you're going to obscure the beer flavor and you got a problem, right? Or maybe you incorrectly handle the additive and you get cough medicine flavors or something like that. One of the things that really just it just gets me, right? When I go into like a shop and they take grapefruit juice and they put it in a beer hopped with something that tastes like grapefruit, right? One of these American hops. Oh, what's the flavor profile of the hop? Grapefruit. What's the fruit juice you added? Grapefruit. All right, that's no good, right? Because if the grapefruit juice or the hop flavor is too intense, it's going to overshadow the other. There's really only one that's going to be in there. You've already got grapefruit, flavor in there. You don't have to add grapefruit juice, right? That's why you pick that hop, right? So think about that too when you're thinking about brewing for competitions. You really don't want your flavors to be redundant as well as obscure the beer flavor. And then of course there's the other, aspect of it is that maybe you didn't add enough of the flavoring, and then you have your beer there, and it might taste a little bit off because the flavoring's doing something, but it's not really enough to complement the beer flavor. So these are the things you're thinking about when you're thinking about competitions. But you're brewing for yourself too, so everybody's got their own taste. So how do you go and decide, okay, I want to do something with raspberries, right? How much raspberries do I add? I don't know. You could add any amount, right? You buy them frozen, you could buy puree, there's a million ways to do it, right? Well, search it up. That's first step, right? So let's go to the online recipes. What are we going to find in online recipes? Well, you're going to find a lot of people who don't know what they're doing and a lot of people who do know what they're doing, and everybody's posted stuff, right? So how do you make sense of all of this? Well, I am going to apply some statistics to some of these things. I'm going to do some searches for you, and I have the results here. But I'm going to use three terms. There's the mean, which is the average, right? So I'm going to take a bunch of recipes, and I'm going to average the amount that's in there, and I'm going to say, okay, that's one way to look at it. I'm going to use the mode, right? Now, the mode just means it's the most common answer, right? So in some cases, let's say 1 pound per gallon of fruit is the most common answer. It happens 3-4 times out of 10 recipes, right? That's what I mean by the mode, right? And then the median is halfway between the lowest and the biggest amount, right? So you say, okay, well, we're going to take, all of these guys that are like out of their minds, right? And they're putting in, but if you know the halfway point between the guys who are out of their minds with the most and out of their minds with the least, maybe we can find a middle point that is somewhere near the target. And it really works because, under ideal circumstances when things are completely random, these numbers aren't going to mean anything. But if they're kind of like around a certain area, you can kind of use these things to find where the sweet spot is. And that's what I'm going to look for when I'm giving you these proposed recipes, okay? So when you add stuff, depends on what you're adding, right? I have had success at the brew pub adding spices to the mash. Right? Now, you wouldn't think you would want to add spices to measure. Wait a second, you're going to boil off all of those wonderful aromas. You boil off a lot of aromas, right? But you don't boil all of them off. And you can get this very nice, gentle kind of spiciness. I brew an apple spice beer. I add like 20% apple juice from a local orchard, and I put, apple pie spices in the mash, and the beer came out tasting like Applejack cereal. Don't you know it was a hit? Because it tasted like cereal, right? Somebody posted something recently about cereal flavor in a beer. Anyway, but you have to be careful. You really don't want to add fruit at any of the early hot stages because fruit are going to release pectins, and you're going to get a haze, and you're going to get a gel. It may not be as important to the home brewer if you're going to filter the beer. Pectins are a real problem if you're intending to filter a beer. Let me tell you, you don't want to deal with it. Although you can buy pectinase, which will break the pectins down if you really want to go that way. But that's like more stuff you're adding, and it's not organic and all of that other stuff, right? So that's the mash, right? So there are things to add to the mash, there are things to not add to the mash. Oh, I almost forgot, squash family vegetables, right? If you're making a pumpkin beer, this is the time to add the pumpkin, right? I will talk about pumpkin a little bit later. It's usually better to roast it. Pumpkin is a very mild flavor if you don't roast it. And it's very hard to get enough in there to get a flavor. But there's no point after the mash where it's really, you're going to get anything out of the pumpkin. I mean, there is starch in the pumpkin, so you want to get some kind of extract out of it as well. So, the boil. What can we put in the boil and what can't we put in the boil? Well, we can't put spice in the boil, right? Put spices in the boil, you're going to extract all of those tannins. Some of them are kind of woody. You're going to get a lot of astringency. You really don't want to add spices to the boil unless you add them at the whirlpool, because that's when the temperature's coming down. You'll be amazed how fast the temperature drops when you turn the heat off. You lose like 10 degrees in the first couple of seconds. It's really fast. And it's, diminishing returns as it's cooling off. But at that stage, you can get a hot extraction without getting all of these astringency, these tannins that's coming off it. Or herbs are really good to add in the boil, right? Think you're making tea, right, with herbs. You add hops in the boil, right? That's an herb, right? So it's a flower. So there are ways you can add herbs during the boil. Primary fermentation is a good time to add a lot of stuff, right? Almost anything can go in the primary ferment. And what's useful there is that you've got a cold extraction now. Now, you're not going to get as much out as you would in a hot extraction, but you're not going to extract all of this other stuff that's going to give you the off flavor. And so that's kind of important. But what happens when you add stuff to a fermentation is that anything that dissolves in carbon dioxide is going to be scrubbed off. The room's going to smell great, but however great the room smells is that much less flavor in your beer, right? So you want to think about whether you really want to add your stuff during the primary ferment as well. And this works well, you know, fruit, spices, herbs, anything, right? Even the spicier vegetables now work. But secondary ferment is probably where I would recommend it. First of all, it's a little bit easier to get sanitation because now there's a little bit of alcohol there, right? So you're not adding something, you know, the nutrients are mainly used up by the yeast, so they've competed out what the bacteria might eat, and so that's very useful. You still will want to sanitize your stuff, but the secondary is where I do a lot of my herb additions, and certainly for fruit as well, right? What's useful for the secondary ferment is if you think alcohol is going to help you get the flavor you want, there's your alcohol, right? So you can do it. So some spices, you're going to get better flavor if you wait till the secondary because the alcohol is going to be there to extract some of the flavors as well. So my recommendation for most things is the secondary. However, you can actually wait until after the secondary and do your additions at packaging, right? So what can you add at packaging, right? Well, I already told one person, don't put hop cones in your package, right? Bad idea, right? Nucleation sites, kaboom. And I only know that because as a beer judge, I have experienced someone who has a gimmick, put a hop cone in their beer, and it was a gusher, and it hit the ceiling, and everybody had a beer bath all around. And it was a lot of fun, you know. But, you know, then I had to drive home stinking of beer, and I was a little bit worried because I was already drunk. And I want to get pulled over, and you've had a beer bath, and you had too much beer. So just think about the people who are going to consume it. Don't stick stuff in the bottle. It's not beer. Anyway, what's good about packaging, you can add juice at packaging, right? You can also add extracts, flavor extracts, you know, vanilla extract and things like that. Now, you might want to try adding these things at the secondary because at packaging, you get a chance to adjust the flavor. So, okay, you take your final gravity and it's like, oh, I don't know, not enough vanilla flavor. You dump a little more in. But if you already know how much you want and how much, you know, what you put in is going to give you, then that's what you want. Then that's a good time to add stuff to. You get no aroma scrubbing at all. Put it in the package, you cap it, or whatever you're doing with your kegs, and the flavor's all in there. So that's really good. So let's go through some of the types of things you throw in your beer. Fruit is an obvious one, right? We've all had fruit beer. You get fruit in a variety of ways. There's whole fruit. You can get extracts, purees, juice. You get fruit flavorings, right? So there's a lot of ways to add it to the beer. My recommendation for fruit is primary or secondary ferment. And just to be aware that, you know, when you add fruit, you're going to get pectins. And so most people in this room don't care about clarity in their beer, right? They're already used to drinking beer full of yeast, you know, but, you know, the customer, meaning bud drinkers out there, you know, if you're a commercial brewer, you're going to be giving beer to people who expect it to be clear and clean flavored. And so, you know, you got to deal with pectin haze if you want to do that. And certainly, like I said before, filtration's a problem with pectin haze. One of the issues with fruit that you have to really be careful of is that, especially with juices, most of the juice you buy in the supermarket has preservatives added. And this is going to stop your ferment. It's going to kill your ferment, right? The preservatives are preventing microorganisms from growing. Yeast is a microorganism. A guy who's putting it on a supermarket shelf doesn't want yeast growing in it any more than you do, you know. So when you add juice, just be careful. You know, you're going to get a fresh pressing, you know, if you can. Get stuff that has no preservatives, you know. Amazon, I'm sure, has it, but, you know, maybe your local fruit farm has something that's fresh pressed and they're selling right there, you know. So think about it that way, right? You know, definitely be careful when you're working with juices and additives. No preservatives or you're in trouble, right? I can tell you from experience, because of course I did this with cranberry juice, making a cranberry beer down the pub, right? I stopped my ferment and I did something else by accident, and the customers loved it, but it wasn't what I intended, right? So I added cranberry juice to this beer, and it was a big beer to start with, right? So now I got all this sweet cranberry juice in there, and it goes nowhere. Well, I added this syrup, right? And the syrup was kind of a little bit thicker, and I created a temperature inversion in my fermenter, and the refrigeration kept reading the thermoprobe, which is in the warm spot, saying, I got to cool this. But there was a spot along the jackets that was completely frozen. So not only did I make a strong beer stronger by creating an ice beer, but it was super sweet from the cranberry juice. Everybody loved it. Yeah, you're a genius, Alex. But it wasn't what I was intending at all. But part of that problem was that the juice the ferment couldn't go any further either. So I was in trouble. Anyway, it is what you tell them it is, right? Okay, so when you're adding fruit, you're not just adding the fruit flavor, right? You're adding other flavors. There's acidity, right? Fruits have their own sourness. It's why it goes with sour beer, but it's going to compound the sourness from the sour beer. So just be careful that there's going to be some acidity that remains. And actually, when you ferment out the sugar, whatever tastes like a wonderful, super ripe fruit is going to taste already a little bit sour when you ferment that off. So just be ready for that and think about that. Maybe you might want to add some lactose if you're expecting a little bit of sweetness in your beer. Tannins are also there. This is actually something that you want coming from your fruit. You want the skin flavor, right, from the fruit. You don't want just that fruit flavor. You might as well just, get the Virginia Dare fruit extract and put it in, and it's going to taste just like, all the fruit that they put in your medicine, and it's not going to be really what you want. You want the complexity. You want the seeds, right? You want the skins. All of those add flavors, especially when you're working with cherries, actually. Cherries, have cyanide in the pits, but this gives it a wonderful almond flavor. so, so, I mean, you can get carried away, but I don't think you're going to poison yourself, adding whole cherries to your beer, but you are going to get a more complex and more full cherry flavor. And so these are the things you have to kind of abide by. When you're adding fruit, you're not just adding that fruit flavor, you're adding all these other flavors as well that come from like the flesh of the fruit and the skin. So now we get to some rules of thumb about the fruit. This applies to whole fruit and puree. I've got my nice thermometer here, right? If you're putting low amounts of fruit, like a half a pound per gallon, you should have a very light beer, because the fruit's not going to have a very strong sort of perception in the final product. It'll be detectable, you'll get it, but if you only want it as a minor flavor component, half a pound per gallon is great. 1 pound per gallon, this is where you start getting into the balance, right? And this is different for different fruits, right? Of course, some fruits have very strong flavors. 1 pound per gallon may be very strong, but most fruits in general, you're balancing things with about 1 pound per gallon. And then at 2 pounds per gallon, the fruit flavor starts to dominate the other flavors, right? So that's going to be the big flavor in the beer. And you may not even know you're drinking beer. It could be a Bartles and James at that point, right? It's going to be like that. So I went online and I looked at raspberry, and I kept only recipes where it was added to the secondary, and only using fresh or frozen raspberries. And so these are the numbers I got. The mean, the average was 5.3 pounds per gallon. The mode, the most common answer was 5 pounds per, well, this is per 5-gallon batch play. So, just a little over a pound per gallon was the average. Exactly a pound per gallon was the most common answer. And the median between the two, highest and lowest, was about 4.8 per 5-gallon. So all of these are kind of circling one area, right, as the right amount to add. So if you've never made a raspberry beer before, here's your starting point, 1 pound per gallon. That's where you want to be to start. You get your final product, and then you think about it. You say, well, I think I like more raspberry flavor. Throw a little more in, right? Just be ready, to start experimenting at that point. And it's perfectly legit. We love to experiment. That's why we're here. And that's one way to do it. Anyway, so that's your starting point for raspberry beers, right? You go online and you get a bunch of stuff, right? Who here brews raspberry beers? Anybody? Where's your raspberries at? How much you add per gallon? was a week ago. Oh, cool. Oh, okay. I didn't get that last time. That's too bad. Do you have it this week? Oh, okay. Next time, if there's any left. All right. Two special cases I want to mention for fruit. One is cherries, right? If you go to a supermarket and buy cherries there, you're going to make cough medicine. You're going to make 5 gallons of it, okay? It will not be pleasant because your friends will not drink it. It's on you, right? This happens every time when you make a bad batch of beer. Nobody touches it, right? You make a great batch of beer, you'll be lucky to get a 6-pack for yourself, right? But you make a bad batch, it's all you to drink. Sour cherries are what you want, and you can get sour cherries sometimes at the supermarket, but they're not always available. You can buy them online. Montmorency cherries are made out in Wisconsin, and there's the Charbeek that are the most common cherry, or Cerise du Nord, which are used in Belgium. You might be able to get all of these online, so then you can experiment with which one you like better, but sour cherries are the ones you want, right? Regular dessert cherries, no good. This is actually the same for brewing ciders, by the way. Like all of the apple growers in the United States grow dessert apples, right? So all of these cideries that are, sourcing their apples from American apple growers are really not doing anybody favors by making this cider with these dessert apples. It's always kind of got this like cloying unctuousness to it, right? You got to go to the people who know what they're doing with cider overseas, right? When they make cider, they grow apples that you wouldn't eat. You wouldn't want to taste them, right? They're acidic, they're tannic, right? You wouldn't want it at all. But you drink the cider that's made from those apples. It's well balanced. It's got a good flavor, right? So this is something to consider, which fruit variety you're working with. I've added dessert apples, juice, as I said, to beer, 20% juice. It's not really going to create that cloying, especially when you throw all the herbs and spices in there. But, just something to be aware of. Not every fruit is equal. Some of them are actually, bred for certain purposes. Cranberries. Told you the story of my cranberry beer, right? So cranberries are really something that are very hard to handle for a brewer. You don't want to buy fresh cranberries. No. You put fresh cranberries in beer. I speak from experience, right? I did it. I put it in the beer. It was awful. It was tannic. It was nasty, right? Astringent, right? Awful stuff, right? Use cranberry juice. It's great. There was a guy here who was a brewer. Who was the brewer who was here at the last meeting? There was a guy who brought like a cranberry raspberry beer. He used juice for those in his beer. And so that is a wonderful flavor. You can make your own cranberry juice. Don't put the whole cranberry in. It's talking about skins and seeds. Bad with cranberries. Skins and seeds are to be avoided. Just make the juice and put it in, or buy the juice without the preservatives, because we already learned that lesson, okay, in the beer. So how do we put this stuff in the beer without contaminating it? Well, there's a number of ways to sanitize. My favorite is the Everclear, right? You swish it around. It was very handy to have gallons of Everclear in the house for COVID. All clean, done, right? Everything works, right? It's also good for sanitizing hot pellets when you're dry hopping and things like that, right? But you can use sulfites too. In general, you want 3 tablespoons per gallon. You expose it for 10 minutes, and that should be enough to sanitize the surfaces which are in contact with the liquid, right? Fruits have complex shapes. There's bubbles. Make sure that you agitate a little bit, get everything, all exposed to the sanitizing agent. The other way to deal with it is pasteurizing. Now, we all hear about pasteurizing, and there are rules about food service that apply to pasteurizing. Why is it that food service people have to have a steam table that has 140 degrees, that the food is there at the hot table, 140 degrees? That is when you get pasteurization. That is when you kill all the microorganisms that can get the people. So that's the temperature you want to reach, right? You hit that temperature for 10 minutes, that's 10 pasteurization units, or PUs. Andy's not here, is he? So he would be laughing like you wouldn't believe, putting 10 PUs in the beer. But at any rate, you can go over 2, right? Being more pasteurized isn't so bad either. Obviously, there's going to be changes in the flavor when you over pasteurize. But in general, at least 10 minutes at 140 degrees. You raise the temperature, shorter times are possible, but you can go 150 for 10 minutes, right?
What about freezing?
Freezing does not kill bacteria. So they've got the cell wall, and they don't all die. So freezing's not deadly. Well, to bacteria, right? So. Okay, so we talked about fruit beer, so we're going to talk about sugaring up the beer a little bit. Not a lot, just a little. There are a couple of considerations, right? I got my wise man there telling everybody, you want to choose a sugar that yeast cannot ferment. Why, may you ask, right? Well, if you're going to put sugar that the yeast can ferment in their bottles, you can ship your bottles to the Ukraine and they can use them against the Russians because they're just not stable, okay? It's really important to understand that you put glucose in the bottle for your priming sugar because they create carbonation. You want some other sugar that's in there. Brewers yeast cannot ferment lactose. There's a few other sugars that they can't ferment, but lactose is the one that everybody uses, and that's the reason, right? Brewers yeast just, they see it, and it's like the nitrogen in the air in this room, right? It doesn't affect them at all, right? They just completely ignore it. But humans can still perceive the sweetness from lactose, and so that's what you want to have in their beer, okay? And there are some rules of thumb for lactose too. They look remarkably like the rules of thumb for raspberries, and that's or fruit, and that's kind of unusual, but I did glean this from the interwebs. About a half a pound per gallon is semi-dry, so it's kind of like, okay, it's not all the way dry, but it's not sweet. Then 1 pound per gallon is semi-sweet. It's like, okay, it's not very sweet, but I know there's sugar in there. And then 2 pounds per gallon is sweet. And to give you an idea, somebody gave away the Lindemann's Framboise secret and put out on the internet 2.5 pounds of sugar per 5 gallons, right? So that is how much sweetness you get from that much sugar, okay? So now you can gauge it. Okay, 2 pounds per gallon is kind of close to that. So, to give you an idea, if you really want a sweet beer, you can go there, but that's how much you're adding. Herbs. Okay. The source material can be fresh or dried or extracts. We'll get into different types of extracts in a minute. And like I said before, in the handling, basically later in the handling, boiling is really good for herbs. You get a lot of aromas out. Primary and secondary ferment, and if you have extracts, you can do it in the packaging. Flowers are a subtype of herb, really. Some people call flowers herbs. You get a lot of teas could be herbs or flowers, right? So the source material could be the same, or even distillates as well. You get rose water and orange blossom water and things like that, right? Those are distillates. You're actually adding those things to water and then distilling off the aromas. But I think I might be discussing that in another slide. Handling them just like the herbs, right? Flowers are kind of herbs, right? One thing to remember when you're handling flowers is if you're picking fresh flowers, there's the green part of the flower. You don't want that in the beer. That's going to give you like these cabbagey, vegetal kind of flavors, right? You just want petals in the center of the flower. You don't want all of that other gook in there. So just remember, when it's a flower, no green, just flower. Now we get to the extracts. Okay, you guys may have seen the words infusion and decoction before. This is what they mean. An infusion is basically like making a sun tea, right? It's a cold and it's a water extraction, or it's a room temperature or even warm extraction, but it's in water. A decoction is when you boil it. Just like when you take a decoction mash, you're taking some out and boiling it, right? That's decoction, but it's still water, right? So when you make tea, you're making a decoction, right? Then there's a tincture. That's when you're doing an infusion, but instead of water, you're doing it with alcohol, right? People who make limoncello are making a tincture, right? So they're taking your peels, putting them in Everclear, never vodka, Everclear, and getting their extract that way. And that extracts oils, right? And that's useful to think about, when you're extracting with alcohol. The reason you do it with alcohol is because you don't want the water extractable stuff. You want the alcohol extractable stuff. So water extractable stuff can be bad. If you make a limoncello with vodka instead of Everclear, you're going to get something that tastes more like furniture polish than really lemon, right? So you want the lemon oils to come out in the Everclear. Anyway, then there's this distillate. Like they said, water, right? Absinthe is a distillate. Gin is a distillate. but there's also, orange blossom water and rose water and stuff like that. Basically, you put the ingredient in either alcohol or water, and then you distill it off, and the aromas come off, and now you've got all of these concentrated aromas, and they're very useful. So, what I wanted to do for everybody was come up with like a sample recipe for a Saison. No way. Everybody puts everything in Saison. And so it's whatever you got is what goes in there. So all I could say is I came up with a long list of stuff that I found and people putting in Saisons, herbs, flowers, spices, everything can go in there, right? Be careful. What you want is to make each flavor ingredient, at least for a Saison, you don't want any of them to show and be the party. You want them all to kind of blend and give it an herbalness or a spiciness without actually being able to make the call which of them you're using, right? That's the trick with the Saison. So we've moved on to spices now. Source materials are very clear. You don't get fresh spices anywhere, right? Except maybe mace. Everything else is going to be dried or it's going to be a tincture. You get these spice extracts like vanilla extracts and things like that. Those are tinctures. And so that's what you might be adding to your beer. The spice flavors are derived from volatile oils, right? So you want to add them later because you're going to boil them off, right? If you put them in the boil, off they go, volatile oils, real easy, right? Great incense, the room smells great when you're boiling it. Beer's not going to taste so great, right? For other reasons, so be careful about that. The timing of addition, you can put them in the mash, as I said before. You're going to boil off a lot, but you get to keep some too. Whirlpool's good. A lot of recipes that I'm going to show you call for the spices at the whirlpool. And so the whirlpool is really one of the areas that you can use. But primary, secondary ferment, more intense flavors. At service, you can add herbs and spices, right? Think about mulled wine. You can mull beer too, right? So you could take a brown ale and make something where you put orange peel and ginger and stuff in it, and boil it with that, and then serve that to your guests. Maybe a little brandy in there, it's Christmas time, right? So do all of that stuff. But you have to be careful that, when you're boiling spices, you're leaching all of these tannins. So even if you're doing it as a mulling thing, put something sweet in there, like a little bit of honey or something, to just take that edge off. So I came up with a couple of common herb spice beers, wit beer and goes. I didn't get a lot of recipes for goes. I got 8 for wit beer. And once again, we're looking at mean, mode, and medium. And you can see that, for coriander and for curacao orange peel, the most common answer was about a half an ounce per 5-gallon batch. But, the mean was lower than that and the median was lower than that. So that's telling me that maybe there were some, a lot of answers around a half ounce, but there were a bunch like lower than that, right? There weren't a lot higher than that. There were a bunch lower than that. So think about it that way, right? That maybe lower than that's what you want. I'm not a big fan of coriander flavor in beer, so I always cut my coriander to half of my orange peel in my wit beer because I just think it's too strong a flavor, even though it's kind of orangey in and of itself. With goes, you also have coriander in there, but there's less than in a wit beer. You see the recipes kind of call for about half. But what I really wanted to get at was that goes is very like a wit beer, but it's got salt in it. It's like, okay, I'm curious, how much salt really is used in a goes, right? Because you want something that's, going to be kind of like blood level salt without really being super salty. That's unpleasant or not salty enough. And so it seems to me like... That's an awful interesting level there. Yeah, right. I don't know. Sorry. Sundown now. I'm waking up now. But yeah, so somewhere around that, it seems like the mean and the median came out a little lower. So there were probably a lot of answers that were less than a half ounce per 5 gallons. So you might want to start out with 0.3 or 0.4 and see how you feel about that. And then the next time you brew, do that. And salt is a very easy thing to experiment with in the glass. If you can measure that little bit amount of salt, you can probably get an idea of how much is going to give you the flavor you want. Okay, obviously when you're using multiples, right, you're going to have to be careful that each spice has to balance each other spice. Yeah, it's crazy, right? Because clove and cinnamon and ginger, You go to the recipes first and see what you think, and then you can go balance. Second or third batch will probably be what you want, right? Because you got to not only balance the additives with each other, but you also got to balance them with the beer flavors, and it's a headache, right? But let's look at pumpkin spice and Christmas spice because everybody like brews these beers. So first we'll go with pumpkin spice. Well, when I went to 10 recipes, right? First of all, everybody was adding it at the end of the boil, so in the whirlpool, right? So whatever I was saying about, spices and boiling, nobody else is paying any attention to. But I really mean it when I say it. So the first three ingredients, which were in the most of the batches, were cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger. They were 80% of the recipes. And in general, all of them, here's where the fluctuations got out of control, right? But the most common answer was going to be about a half a teaspoon now per 5 gallons. And I had some conversion because they didn't all give them in teaspoons. But, I went to my, I don't know, what was it, Joy of Cooking, and I got the conversion from grams to ounces to teaspoons, and I applied that to these herbs. Vanilla was fairly used. Pumpkin pie spice was usually used by itself, obviously, right? Because you're mimicking pumpkin pie. But the first three ingredients, nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger, are basic pumpkin pie recipes. So you can see everybody's shooting for pumpkin pie flavor. Later ones I found only used in one recipe: cardamom, allspice, and mace, right? It seemed like only one person wanted to add those of the people who were publishing online. Cardamom's unusual. I love cardamom, but I don't know. If I got that in a pumpkin beer, I wouldn't be expecting it. So some of those things to take care of, to think about. Christmas spice, once again, we get something where people are really think about mulled wine and they're translating it to beer and they're brewing the beer with the spices because cinnamon, orange peel, ginger, and clove are in mulled wine along with star anise. And usually there's a considerable amount of brandy or honey, something sweet in there as well. And then other herbs and other spices can be added as well, but those are the main ones. I gave you some idea of the means and modes and medians. People are like cinnamon nuts with Christmas spice beers. I think cinnamon is way strong in a beer, and you got to be really careful how much you add. Same for clove, by the way, but cinnamon is just one of those things where I have had way too many Christmas beers that have had too much cinnamon in them. So probably the numbers I'm giving you here are too much, right? But these other ones maybe were in the ballpark, so think about that, right? Now, once again, I had to do some translations here. And this, by the way, has been posted already on the Facebook site, and I guess it can be moved to the website, along with the other. So you'll be able to look at these tables and kind of glean for yourself what you want. Okay, we're getting there. Vegetables, not vegetables. Okay, squash, pumpkin, habaneros, right? Hot peppers. These are people's favorite vegetables to add, except they're fruits, right? They're not vegetables, right? But we put them in the vegetable category because they're not super sweet. Anyway, usually people don't put cabbage in their beer and stuff, right? It's just not, the thing to do. And most vegetables have a very mild flavor in the final product. So if you're going to put a vegetable in, you want the flavor to show, roast it before you put it in the beer, okay? That's really the main message I had for vegetables. Other than that, there's not a lot to say about it. Most pumpkin spice beers don't have any pumpkin in them, right? They're pumpkin spice, not pumpkin spice, so think about it that way. I had a great beer. I was judging a contest that had habaneros. They were roasted habaneros with blackberry, and the heat was so perfect. It was not so strong that you couldn't take another sip. It was just one of those things where you could drink a whole pint of this stuff and it wouldn't have really maxed out your palate at all. So there are ways to do it. But, with the hot stuff, very, very, very small amounts. There's very few of these hot beers that really work. Certainly do not drink the hot beer while you're eating chili, okay? You are just asking for problems, right? Nobody in the household is going to love you if you eat that stuff. So a couple more special cases. There are ingredients that contains oils. Now, we know that oils can kill foam on beer. So how do you handle them, right? Well, coffee is one that's often in beer. You can cold brew, right? That extracts less of the oil, so that's one way to get around it. You can do it high strength too, right? You know, and maybe use fewer beans but get a stronger flavor, like, you know, espresso grind or something. Chocolate, don't put chocolate candy in the beer, okay? Because that is mostly cocoa oil, right? You don't want that. Get cocoa powder, okay? That's what you want. That's going to give you the chocolate flavor without filling your beer with oil. And of course, nuts are very oily too, right? Just use the flavorings, don't use the nuts themselves, okay? And you'll be fine with that. Flavorings are usually better. Whoop, I went ahead too fast. Second special case, and then we'll get on. Yeah.
You think the cocoa powder works better than cocoa nibs?
Probably, yeah, because
I made a chocolate milk stout, and I used the nibs. And honestly, I didn't get as much chocolate flavor as I really expected I was going to get. And I used quite a bit of nibs, with maybe like I think a pound of cocoa nibs for like a 5 gallon batch. And so the flavor was there, but it was just barely.
there you go. Well, either you stay with the cocoa nibs and add more, or you add the cocoa powder. And then you're starting from scratch with that, right? Yeah, cocoa powder. Every time I've had something that's supposed to have chocolate flavor, cocoa powder is the one. But think about it. When you're adding chocolate malt and roasted barley to the beer, you're going to get chocolate flavors anyway. So if you're adding chocolate to a stout, you're wasting your time. It's already there. Don't do it, right? If you're adding chocolate, say, to a Pilsner, that would be an interesting thing to try. I'm not saying I would have a second, but it would be something that would be a nice experiment.
Who makes a chocolate dimple? It's actually really good.
Right, that's a good beer to do it with, right? Because the Dunkel's got all of the Munich malt flavors, right? So that's interesting.
More thirsty there. Yeah, more thirsty.
Right, right,
Semi-crushed, like they said, it can have a flavor for it.
right. But just find a way to avoid the oils is the main point, you know. So yeah, the nibs could work as well, but
The same thing with the nibs. I just wanted more.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
cut the powder's easier to find.
It's nibs and the lactase.
Swiss Miss, right? Anyway, there's a lot of flavorings that come from wood. You know, we're talking about the barrel challenge, right? You're deriving your flavors from wood, just like you're doing from whiskey. You wouldn't be surprised if the beer takes up whiskey flavors. So when you're thinking about what kind of recipe you want, think about what kind of flavor goes with whiskey. And then you work from there, okay? With the barrel, the char is important. There's lightly charred and heavily charred. The more charred it is, the more intense those whiskey flavors are going to be. If it's not at all charged, it could be very neutral. I've had stuff, it can taste like a lumber yard, right? So, you know, it's just like raw wood flavor. So, not always pleasant, right? Yeah, so just think about that. Wood chips, same. You want charred wood chips if you can get them. Wood chips, you got to sterilize in the pressure cooker, right? There's just too many nooks and crannies to sterilize with the methods I gave you. You got to use a pressure cooker to sterilize those. I can't give you any recommendations for how much of that. I've never experimented with that. Smoked malt. Well, I tried to get a consensus online for the smoked malt. Nothing doing, right? Some people thought, you know, a couple of ounces in 5 gallons was too much, you know, and others thought that, you know, 100% hickory smoked malt was the greatest thing they ever had, right? So if you like smoked flavor, have at it. If you don't like smoked flavor, don't do it, you know, and don't make your friends have it either, you know, just be careful. Spruce tips, like I said earlier to a number of people, now's the time to harvest your spruce tips, okay? If you're interested in a piney flavor in your beer, but not a turpentine flavor in your beer, you get the green tips. You see them all on the spruce trees everywhere. That's what you want to be picking right now. It can give kind of almost like there's a piney aroma, but it's more like a Coca-Cola flavor or something like that to the beer. It's interesting. A lot of people do it. Tavern Porter has it, I think, right? Yard's Tavern Porter. I brought one that I made with spruce tips there, spruce porter. It's not like Tavern Porter, but, you know, give you an idea what spruce tastes like in beer.
Where would you use this stick?
I add them at whirlpool. Yeah.
That's because of the oil.
There's the oils there, yeah, like I said, turpentine, those pine oils. But the green spruce tips, really, before they get stiff, they don't have a lot of that. So they're very fresh and leafy.
Yeah.
I'll put like, what, 3 ounces in a beer or something like that? Is that what you use?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, yeah. So, some flavors don't come through to the final product, right? Maple syrup, I don't know how many people, I'm gonna make a maple beer, right? And, you can make it half maple syrup and you get no maple flavor at the end, right? It just really doesn't come through, right? So it's one of those things where the entire liquid content of the beer almost has to be maple sap or maple syrup to get a flavor. Honey, the same way. You make a mead, it's great, but a beer, there's a lot of other flavors there, right? And so you're not going to taste anything. Unroasted pumpkins and apple juice we covered. Mice that roar. I already covered cinnamon and cloves, but there are others. I've played with grains of paradise before. It's pretty strong. It's not that different from clove, actually. Molasses can be really bad, and too much, so you got to be careful with molasses. Lavender. People love it, people hate it. It's like smoke flavor, right? It's guys versus girls or whatever, right? You don't want your beer tasting like French whorehouse, okay? So go easy on the lavender, right? Hot peppers we covered. Liquid smoke. This is powerful stuff, man. Don't use too much of it, okay? Don't use a lot. No, it's bad. Okay, so I've come all the way around. So now that we've thought about all these herbs and spices and fruits, think again about complementation, contrast, synergy, and matching intensity of flavors. And so go out there and brew. Get them. Thank you.
Hey.
Mike?
One that you missed, coffee.
Amen.
I had coffee, yeah. I had coffee in the stuff that has oils, right? Do you want cold?
When you talk about intensity,
Yes.
talk about coffee intensity.
Coffee is pretty intensity, actually. Yeah. So it is a very strong flavor. And once again, a lot of people will add coffee to stout, but stout already has coffee flavor. It's really one of those unnecessary flavor additives, as far as I'm concerned.
Thoughts on like roasted coffee versus green coffee, please?
No, I've never played with a green coffee bean, so I couldn't tell you what they're supposed to taste like. So I don't know how it would come through in a beer.
I wouldn't do it. It tastes like these.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've had some coffee where I swear, like, you use green coffee because it's super fresh.
Really?
But maybe that's just the style.
Yeah, I don't know if you should use a high roast or like a light breakfast roast or something like that either. That's going to all factor in.
I mean, there's a lot of variables there.
Right, yeah. Yep.
This is an excellent presentation. Can we put this up on the website?
It's on the Facebook page already in the files section.
It's on the Facebook page. It will be on the website if it's not there already. And our friend Dave is recording, and so this entire presentation you can watch over and over and over again on our YouTube channel. That's it.
Cheers. Yeah. Cheers. And now for the drinking.